This month, about 70 million Americans will receive a payment they didn't have to ask for. It arrives on a schedule. It arrives whether the economy is good or bad, whether the market is up or down, whether anyone in Washington is paying attention. Most people who get it have stopped thinking of it as remarkable. It's just there. The way water is there when you turn the tap. Before 1935, it did not exist. Not a smaller version of it. Not a worse version of it. Nothing. If you were old in America and your money ran out, there was no system waiting underneath you. There was your family if you had one, and if they could afford you. There was charity if you were lucky and local and considered deserving. And when those failed, there was one place left. They called it the poorhouse. Every county had one or shared one. They were working farms, most of them. You were expected to labor if you were able, and getting in cost you more than your dignity. In many places, entering meant surrendering whatever property you still owned. In some, it meant losing the right to vote. It could mean losing the right to leave. In certain jurisdictions, relief recipients were required to wear a large letter P on their clothing, so that anyone who saw you in the street would know exactly what you were. That was the safety net. It was designed to be terrible, deliberately, so that people would do anything to avoid needing it. This is the story of the 10 years in which that changed, and of the woman who got the first check. To understand why the poorhouse was so full, you have to understand what old age actually was in America before the Depression. There were no pensions for almost anyone. A handful of large employers offered them, railroads, some utilities, but they were rare and they were revocable, and a company that failed took its pension with it. There was no retirement in the sense we mean now. There was working, and then there was not being able to work anymore. And the gap between those two things was where people fell. Some states had begun to act. By 1935, most had passed some form of old age assistance law. But the laws were mostly gestures. In practice, only about 3% of elderly Americans were actually receiving anything under them, and the average payment came to roughly 65 cents a day. 65 cents. Not a supplement to a pension, the entire provision for the small minority who got it at all. Then the Depression arrived and did something particular to older people. It didn't just take their jobs, it took their savings when the banks failed. It took the value of their homes. It took their children's ability to support them, because their children were out of work too. Every private arrangement that had quietly held up old age in America, family, thrift, property, failed at the same moment for the same reason. By 1934, the government's own estimate was that more than half of the elderly people in the United States could not support themselves. Not half of the poor ones. Half of all of them. A whole generation at the end of their working lives, discovering simultaneously that there was nothing underneath. In Long Beach, California, a physician named Francis Townsend was in his mid-60s and out of work. The story he told afterwards was that he looked out of his window one morning and saw 3 elderly women going through a rubbish bin, searching for food. Whether it happened exactly that way, nobody can now confirm. What is certain is what he did next. He wrote a letter to a local newspaper proposing a solution, and the solution was enormous. Every citizen aged 60 and over would receive $200 a month from the federal government. Not a supplement. A pension larger than most working Americans earned. The only conditions were that you had to be retired. You had to have no criminal record. And you had to spend the entire $200 within 30 days. That last condition was the engine of the whole idea. Townsend wasn't only trying to rescue the old. He was trying to force money through a frozen economy. If 12 million people were compelled to spend $200 every month, the theory went, the Depression would be spent out of existence. It would be paid for by a 2% tax on every business transaction in the country. And the country went for it. Within 2 years, there were more than 7,000 towns and clubs across America, with over 2.2 million members. Polling found 56% of Americans in favor. Petitions arrived in Washington by the sackful. Congressmen who dismissed it found themselves facing rooms of furious constituents in their 60s and 70s. There was only one problem, and it was arithmetic. The plan would have paid out roughly $2.4 billion every month. Total national income in 1933 was about $46 billion for the entire year. Townsend was proposing to hand something close to 2/3 of everything the country earned to 9% of its population. It could not work. But it had already done something that could not be undone. It had made doing nothing politically impossible. Franklin Roosevelt did not want the Townsend Plan. He thought it was ruinous arithmetic dressed up as compassion. But he could count, and 2.2 million organized old people in an election cycle is a number a president pays attention to. So his administration built something else, and the something else was deliberately, almost defensively modest. The work was handed to a committee on economic security, chaired by his Secretary of Labor, Frances Perkins, the first woman to hold a seat in an American cabinet. She had spent her career on factory floors and in tenement districts, and she was the one who insisted that old age provision belong in the bill at all. On the 14th of August 1935, Roosevelt signed the Social Security Act. Against Townsend's $200 a month, it promised between $10 and $85. Against Townsend's age 60, it set $65. And where Townsend proposed a tax on everyone to pay everyone, Roosevelt's version worked differently, in a way that mattered more than the numbers. You paid in, out of your wages matched by your employer, into a fund held by the Treasury, and later you drew it back out. It was framed not as relief, but as insurance, something you had bought and were owed, not something you were given. Roosevelt was explicit about why. Those payroll taxes, he said, were there to give contributors a legal, moral, and political right to collect. With those taxes in place, no politician could ever scrap the program. He was designing it to survive him, and he was right. It has outlasted every administration since, including several that would have liked to unmake it. But there was a catch built into the design, and it was a strange one. Because the program was insurance rather than charity, you could not simply hand money to people who were already old. They hadn't paid in. So the law set up a waiting period. Taxes would begin coming out of wages in January 1937, the deduction that Americans now know as FICA. Monthly payments would not begin until January 1940, which meant that for the first 3 years of Social Security, the government collected and paid nobody at all. In Ludlow, Vermont, a woman named Ida Mae Fuller worked as a legal secretary. She had been a school teacher once, and one of her pupils, years earlier, had been a boy named Calvin Coolidge, who went on to become president. She never married. She had no children. She was, in other words, exactly the person the old system had nothing for. She was born in 1874, which meant that when payroll taxes began in 1937, she was already 62. She paid in for just under 3 years before she stopped working. The total she contributed was $24.75. On the 4th of November, 1939, she walked into the field office in Rutland to ask whether she might be entitled to anything. She said later that she hadn't expected much. She wasn't sure she was owed anything at all. On the 31st of January 1940, the government issued check number 00000001. It was made out to Ida Mae Fuller for $22.54. She had paid in $24.75. Her first single payment gave almost all of it back. And then she kept living. When the act was signed, life expectancy for an American woman was 64. Ida Mae Fuller reached 65, and then 70, and then 80. She stayed in Ludlow. The checks kept arriving every month for 35 years. She died in 1975, aged 100. Over those 35 years, she collected $22,888.92 from a contribution of $24.75. 924 times what she put in. Not because she cheated it, because she was first and because she lived. It's tempting to look at Ida Mae Fuller's $22,000 and see a flaw. A system that paid out 900 times what it took in, to the very first person who asked. But that's the wrong reading, and it misses what actually happened in those 10 years. Every private arrangement America had for old age, savings, property, family, the goodwill of employers, was tested at once in the 1930s, and all of them failed together. That was the discovery. Not that individuals had been careless, but that the risk was too large to be carried individually at all. You cannot save your way out of a decade in which the banks fail, the jobs vanish, and your children are broke too. So the country did the only other thing available. It stopped asking each old person to carry the risk alone, and spread it across everyone who was still working. That's all Social Security is underneath the politics. Not a savings account, not a return on investment. A very large group of people agreeing to carry a risk together, because none of them can carry it by themselves. Which is why the Fuller arithmetic isn't a scandal. She wasn't paid back her own money with interest. That was never the design. She was paid by the people still working, exactly as she'd been promised, and exactly as the people working today are paying for the 70 million receiving it this month. The poorhouse closed. The letter P came off the coats, and what replaced them wasn't wealth or generosity or a clever investment. It was a promise that a country made to itself in 1935 and has kept every month ever since.